Hello, my name is Bob Enyart, and you're listening to Catholic versus Protestant.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, if you would please, who you are, what you believe, and why you believe what you believe.
I've been a talk show host for 28 years on the most powerful Christian radio station in America, Denver's K-Light, AM 670 KLTT, 50,000 watts. And I'm the pastor of Denver Bible Church, but I grew up very differently. I grew up a Catholic. I went 8 years Catholic grammar school in New Jersey, St. Anthony's in Hawthorne. I was an altar boy. I read the readings at the Mass, the lectern, I think we called that. I used to walk to Mass a couple miles, hours ahead of my family so that I could get there and be an altar boy and read. And I would do that for 2 or 3 Masses on a Sunday morning for quite some time. So, David, I was very interested in the Lord, but through events in my life and over time, I ended up with a relationship with Jesus Christ that actually brought me out of the church. And so now I'm the pastor of a fundamentalist Bible church, Denver Bible Church.
Before we get into your beliefs and how they contrast with my own, can you just tell me a little bit about your very early childhood? I like to get a little snapshot of some of your earliest memories that have to do with God and religion, and this is positives and negatives.
Yeah, I never had any doubt that God existed. I was fascinated with science and with things that a lot of kids maybe don't get fascinated with. I used to listen to talk radio out of New York City, and the talk show host name was Michael Jackson. And I would call in late night, maybe midnight or so, and talk about, as a young kid, talk about whatever he was talking about, foreign policy or whatever. So I was always very pensive, thoughtful. I remember in second grade, the teacher, Miss Duffy, her brother was a priest. I overheard her say to another teacher, I'd like the kids to see the Apostles' Creed, but I need a copy of it. I got to get a copy of it so I could get it to the kids. And she meant like a mimeograph copy, you know, but I didn't know that. So I went home. It was a Friday. And I told my mother that I had a copy of the Apostles' Creed. And for a little kid in second grade, you know, that's like a big thing. And it took me, I don't know, a couple of hours. And my mother's like, I can't believe your teacher would give you an assignment like this. So we straightened it all out the next week. And But I learned a lot at Catholic school for 8 years academically, but very little spiritually. And when I was in high school, one of the gals, she was killed in a drunk driving accident. And the Mass was packed, of course. Whenever a child dies, it's common. And the priest doing the funeral read these verses that I was from and assured everyone that she was in heaven. And I went up to him afterward, after the cemetery and everything, and said, why is it when you and I talk and I ask you questions, you say we cannot know if we're saved? But in this funeral, you just told everyone, almost 1,000 people, that we know she's in heaven, even though there was really virtually no evidence from her life that she even believed in God. And the answer he gave me was pretty painful. He said, well, we have to be concerned about the feelings of the family. And I thought, as a kid, I mean, I'm still a teenager and just starting in high school. And I thought, you mean you would lie to everyone about the most important things just to not hurt people's feelings? And so anyway, I felt like I was pushed out of the church, David, and just studied the Bible with people around me. Ended up years later, the pastor of a Bible church.
Interesting. I won't dwell too long on biography, but can you just describe, if it's not too painful, the reaction of some of the more devout Catholics in your immediate family when you sort of came out of the closet that you were leaving the church?
Yeah, my mother was the most concerned. Our extended Italian family, we just went to Rome, in fact, in November. Every couple of years, we do a Bible tour of Israel, Greece, Turkey, Italy. And so we went to Italy again. So even though my extended family were basically Catholic, at least nominally Catholic, my mother was the one most concerned. We asked our priest to come to Bible study with us, Father Stepien. He did. And his take on the Exodus was that it was more like mythology. Certainly Genesis was all mythology. Much of the Old Testament, it was hard to discern where he thought the mythology stopped and the history began, with the genealogy of Jesus being mostly mythology, the early parts of it. So my mother was concerned, but I don't know if it was a few months. And then she went with us to regular weekly Bible study and then church. So at that time, this was in the early 70s in northern New Jersey, Hawthorne, New Jersey. There was an exodus of people around us, of certainly dozens of people, entire families. And I say dozens, it was probably scores of people. The family that owned the nicest restaurant in northern New Jersey, Scordato's, they left the church the same time we did. And so anyway, it was sort of an exodus.
What's the relationship like now? Is your mother still alive?
Yeah, she's in the next room. In fact, I'm in our studio, and my mother has been she moved to Colorado to help with our radio outreach. And this happened back in the 70s. So
Okay, so she's no longer practicing Roman Catholic.
that's right. And I could list all the members of our family, but then not only our family, from when I was a freshman in the local public high school, all the families there that began coming to Bible studies. You know, and at some time after that, the Catholic Church had a Bible study movement where my first 7 years, I think, in grammar school, we never saw a Bible. And then they brought in stacks. They installed these bookshelves in the classrooms and put Bibles in them. So maybe a couple times in a year, we actually got a Bible. But David, I went to the rectory with our parish. That's where the priest lived. And I asked one of the priests, he knew I was studying the Bible and we had questions. So I asked him I said, well, I have these Bible verses here that they seem to say you can know you're going to heaven. And he said, well, you got to read those in the Catholic Bible. I said, this isn't Catholic. I don't know. I didn't have my Bible with me. I just wrote down the verses. And so he went into his bedroom. He couldn't find a Bible. So we went into their library. They have a nice room that was their library, maybe 4 priests, and they didn't have a Bible. So we went into the church and we had to go on the altar, the big Bible used in the Mass. You know, you use 2 hands to turn the pages. And that's the Bible we used to look up my half a dozen verses. And they all said exactly what I had written down, you know. So
I want to talk about some of our differences, but before we started recording this, you said you were interested in the question of creation. Can you just sort of give your position and then respond to what you heard on some of my recent episodes?
Yes, I listened to a fascinating podcast you had where you talked about being persuaded theologically that young earth creationism is possibly true. And the observation that you shared was that it's really not conceivable that a sinless human being could come from the womb of an animal. And you said also that that was a repugnant notion. And I so appreciated that. And when you tell kids that they're animals, and our schools, of course, in America, our public schools are officially godless. That's the curriculum and the policies are godless. And they tell the kids that they're animals. It's not surprising when some act like animals. If you tell them they're animals, it's a natural conclusion that it would be okay to act like animals. And so I think that Darwinism has had tremendous destructive effect on the world. And we are not animals. We're made in God's image and likeness. And Jesus took the books of Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you know, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Jesus took them literally, and he spoke about the individuals, and he spoke of them as real people and the events as real events, and that God made us male and female. Well, if the early books of the Bible are mythological, then did God really make us male and female? And did God really institute marriage? And even the 10 Commandments, of course, come from the Exodus. And we've noticed, David, that when people reject the creation, that is the 6 creation days, almost without fail, an institution that rejects those creation days, a church, a denomination, a seminary, whatever. They then go on to reject the global flood, and they reject Babel and the origin of languages, and they reject Moses, the plagues, the Exodus. They reject all of this, and it tends to go as a unit. The first thing you hear is, well, we believe in the Bible, but we think the first days are long periods of time as a day, like the day of salvation. Of course, a day could be a long period of time. And so we say, well, that's a very reasonable position. But then what happens, as soon as we buy into that, then we find out that the order of the creation days have to be rearranged, because the order of events that Moses writes that God did things in Genesis 1, they're not the order of events from the Big Bang and Darwinism. And so as soon as they say the days were long periods of time, then they reorder the days, because they want the sun before the plants, and they want the birds after the land animals. So first they're not evening and morning, the second day, evening and morning, the third day, normal 24. First they're long periods of time. Then the days in Genesis are out of order. Then where Genesis states that there were no thorns before Adam sinned, because God cursed the ground because of Adam's sin, they say, no, there were thorns before man, because we have fossils of thorns, which we do. And when God said everything was very good, at the end of day 6, everything was very good. It was a perfect paradise. God created the fossil record that they think is a record of hundreds of millions of years before man. That shows tremendous suffering and pain and death. Yet the Bible says there was no death before Adam sinned, and that sure seems to mean human death, but also the death and suffering of animals, like an elephant or a horse or a dog or a cat, the kind of animals you can have relationship with. It doesn't make sense that they would suffer the way the fossil record shows suffering in a perfect creation. And then David, they also reject, once they say the days were long periods of time, they reject the great ages of the patriarchs who lived before the flood, like Methuselah and Adam and so on. And then you get to the flood and they reject the flood. And this isn't just coincidental. They all fall like dominoes, because the record of fossils in the geologic column, either that's a record of a global flood or it's a record of billions of years. There's your choices.
I used to be atheist. For 25 years, I was atheist. And the people I was hanging out with weren't exactly the pillars of society. I entered the mafia at age 18. I was hanging out with criminals and drug dealers, sex workers, and stuff like that. It's not nearly as glamorous as you might imagine. And I was very prudish and conservative all the while, just because that's my nature. But I still was moving in that world. And I still live in that world, because I live in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, which is sort of the Las Vegas of Canada. But I just wanted to mention some of these sort of cues that struck my ear differently once I converted to God in 2009, 10 years ago. It didn't have quite the same ring to it when I would talk to a friend, an atheist friend, and I just asked them what they did that weekend, and they would talk about, having some sort of wild animal sex, like monkey sex or something like that. And then what else did you do? Oh, just, vegged out. And then what else did you do? Oh, I got stoned. So if you look at this progression, you see animal like a lower beast, like an animal like a monkey, having that monkey sex. And then you talk about vegetating in front of the television like a vegetable, and then you talk about being stoned like a stone. Like now you're
animal, mineral, vegetable. That's pretty good.
So it really struck me that God did not create us for that. That's not adult entertainment. When you walk around downtown Montreal, you'll see adult stores, and you'll go into these adult stores, and it's butt plugs and dildos and God knows what, robots. Now they have sex robots and stuff like that. So this, to me, is the opposite of adult. To be an adult is to be fully alive, to be embracing your human nature, not denying any part of your human nature, and to be respectful toward yourself, towards others, and above all to God. So I just wanted to mention the sort of reversal where people are willingly sinking into the mire, literally.
People who reject God debase themselves to nothing more than bodily functions. So their communication is often filled with vulgarity. Constant references to defecation, reproductive organs, sex acts. They hardly have a context for thinking of themselves, let alone others, outside of that realm. And their vulgarity drips with this intolerance, anger, hatred toward those they disagree with. And we're told that they're the beautiful people who don't need God, and they believe in free speech and tolerance and diversity and respect for all people. And it's all utter hypocrisy.
I just had a long conversation with one of my most rabid anti-religious atheists on my YouTube channel. He's been emailing me back and forth, and he leaves a lot of nasty comments. But I just asked him, what is the point of life? What is the lasting consequence? What are you going for? What is the meaning? What is the purpose? He said, well, there is no lasting purpose, but in this life, I hope to get laid, meaning to have sex. And so I just simply said, well, that's, if that's your goal, I don't think talking to me is going to bring the ladies, It's not going to get you the ladies. It's not. Right. But, his only hope, he admitted that his only hope is that he might have some good sex. That's it.
Yeah. And in fact, on a college campus, if a professor wants to have sex with students, he's obviously not going to accept the traditional moral foundation of Western culture, because then that would interfere with his lust. And he doesn't have enough self-control to actually look honestly at the evidence, because he's lying to himself. If it's the difference between getting a woman or not, he will lie to himself. But David, I don't know if you've noticed the couple places where the Bible in the New Testament talks about evidence, like in the epistle to the Hebrews, faith is the evidence of things not seen. So I have faith that gravity, is a real force. And if I step off a mountaintop, we climb the 14ers here in Colorado, I'm going to be hurt. So I have faith in gravity, even though I can't see it. So faith is the proper response to the evidence of things not seen. And that's, that's not an ignorant statement from the perspective of modern science, even. From modern science, that's pretty insightful.
Yeah. How do Christians justify Jesus' words, for example, about Noah and the flood? How do they justify that and remain Christian and at the same time distance themselves from being a young earth creationist? And then a part B to that question would be, are there a lot of people that are afraid to come out of the closet as being young earth creationists?
Yeah, there are many professional scientists who are afraid, and we know that. I've been interviewing scientists for decades. Studies have been done. I'll be interviewing Dr. Jerry Bergman in studio in a couple weeks. He's got, I think, 4 PhDs, and he has documented what he calls the slaughter of the dissidents. Countless professionals, well-published, extremely successful, who get driven out of their profession for only doubting Darwin, let alone supporting creation or intelligent design. So within our religious Bible colleges, Christian universities, seminaries, they've almost all gone to old earth, no global flood, no exodus. The vast majority. There's a handful that still teach what Jesus taught. In Australia, there's a huge creation ministry called CMI, Creation Ministries International. And the president of that group was having lunch with the president of their local Christian university. And he read this verse to the president of the university, where Jesus said that God made us male and female at the beginning of the creation, at the beginning. So that would mean not after millions of years, not after billions, but at the beginning. So the president of this Christian university said, well, we know more about science than Jesus did. And Dave, yeah, you're laughing is right. And this guy almost fell off his chair. Because Christianity teaches that Jesus is God the Son, the creator of the universe. John 1:1, whether you read it in the Greek or the English, Jesus created everything that was created. And to say that we know more than he did about any topic. Wow.
Wow. It's crazy. There's so many questions I want to ask you. I guess I want to talk a little bit about the science. There's anthropology, ancient societies, and all this sort of thing. And then there's cosmology, like the light from the stars couldn't possibly have reached us from such great distances. That's one of the ones that bugs me a little bit. I don't want God setting this phony ersatz stage where everything's just set up to look old. How would you deal with that one and some of the other issues that seem very damning to our position?
Well, we love all these things, and I have eagerly taken on so many old earthers or atheist scientists. And well, first, something I heard you say. You mentioned the cultures that have genealogies going back to Noah and Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. I thought that was a brilliant observation. And then you or your guest said, well, they also have flood stories. And then your guest said something that was really not accurate. He said, yeah, but those flood stories are nothing like in Genesis. Well, anthropologists have documented over 200 flood stories from all over the world, and they have uncanny similarities. They're not all the same. There's only one book that is the scriptures, God's word. So these are sort of darkened corporate memories of the global flood, but they have things like, people and animals being saved in some kind of vessel. And the guy, whether he's Gilgamesh or whatever his name is, he lets a bird go and the bird comes back and they try to figure out when to get out of the boat. And the similarities are astounding. Yes, there are plenty of differences, but the major themes, it's shocking how many cultures have those same themes in their flood story. So you were right. And when we look at dinosaur bones, the biggest thing is the dinosaur soft tissue. They're breaking open dinosaur bones in museums all over the world. They're publishing the results in the journals Nature, Science, Paleontology, and they're finding that they're loaded with soft tissue. Dinosaur blood vessels, proteins. This is the greatest discovery in the history of paleontology, and the media is scared to death to report it because it screams out that the dinosaur bones are young. So 26 science journals in the past few years, 26 different journals, and these are all leading mainstream journals, have published dinosaur soft tissue where they're sequencing proteins of dinosaurs at Harvard. They have DNA now from a hadrosaur and a T-Rex. It's not the full genome, it's just little bits. But the evidence is the dinosaur bones are more like Egyptian mummies than they are like they're stone and 80 million years old. So that's from geology. And Googling dinosaur soft tissue really opens people's eyes. But then you go to cosmology, and that's a fabulous challenge. God gave us a brain. He said, come, let us reason together. And so when someone says, well, the Bible implies the earth is less than 10,000 years old, but we have stars and galaxies that are not only a million light years away, but billions of light years away. So surely it cannot be that the universe is young, because the light would have never reached us. And I think you already said, David, that you don't believe that God would have created the world with a false impression, like a fake history in the world. Like one guy wrote a book ages ago, and the atheists talk about it almost every day. And in his book, he said that the fossils were created by God in the rocks to make it look like there were animals that were killed. And that's really stupid, and no church, no denomination, no school ever picked that up. But the atheists talk about it as though that's what we all teach, that God put a false record in the fossils. Well, it would be just as wrong to say God put a false record in the light from the stars. But what does the light from the stars tell us? If an atheist who believes in the Big Bang, that the universe is 13.8 billion years old, they have a starlight and time problem. Theirs is called the horizon problem. And the fact that the universe has basically the same temperature across the entire universe in every direction we look at, even though there's not been enough time for light to travel from one end of the universe to the other so that the temperature could even out. It's called the horizon problem. And the temperature is about the same to like 1 part in 10,000 or something like that. And so that's their horizon problem. And they've created wild secondary and tertiary assumptions, wild assumptions to try to answer their starlight and time problem, when I think the answer is in the Bible. 7 different books of the Bible and 11 different verses say that God stretched out the heavens. And so God is God. He's able to do that if he wants to. So I think that indicates it wasn't a bang. Everything, it didn't start from a central, Big Bang event, but instead, by God stretching out the heavens, literally, I believe he pulled the light from the stars, stellar nucleosynthesis. He pulled the light out of the stars and he brought it to the earth because that was his purpose. His purpose was for the earth, for the firmament of the heavens to be majestic and for them to mark the days and the months and the seasons and so on. And so because it was his purpose, he didn't want to create Adam and have Adam wait, 40 million years until he could see. He didn't want to even wait 4 years till he could see Alpha Centauri. He wanted Adam that first night to be able to look up at the heavens and be in awe of his creator. So that's how I believe that God stretched the light. So the light actually came from every star and every galaxy to the earth and beyond, filling the universe.
What about geocentrism? I've heard some arguments that sound pretty convincing from the point of view of modern physics and astronomy and cosmology that we can account for that geocentrism because the center of mass just happens to be centered on the Earth. Do you have any opinion about that, or does the Bible talk about that?
Sure. A couple things happen, galactocentrism, geocentrism. Your guest brought up the flat earth, and it was a non sequitur for him to say, well, if you believe in creation, then the logical conclusion is a flat earth. And that's a non sequitur because never did the Catholic Church teach the earth was flat. Never. The church fathers didn't teach the earth was flat. Never did any Protestant university or denomination. And the flat earth movement is a phenomenon today in France. 10% of the public think the earth is flat or might be flat. And so flat earthism, for one thing, it's not a hypothesis. It's a diagnostic of a paranoia. Like everyone is lying to me about everything. So therefore, I think even the earth is flat. And so we went to New Zealand to protest Bill Clinton. We were there for a week. And so when we're down there, we made a point to look at the moon. We live in the northern hemisphere. They're way down south. And we see the man in the moon, his 2 eyes and his mouth. We just call it the man in the moon, right? Well, down in the southern hemisphere, the man in the moon is upside down, of course, because they're at the bottom of the globe. And the stars rotate in the sky in the opposite direction. So these are 2 pretty good pieces of evidence for something that was known for millennia, that the earth is a sphere. So then there's the thought, well, perhaps the universe revolves around the earth every 24 hours. I don't know if you were getting to that question. That would mean that Neptune is moving far faster than the speed of light in order to orbit us once every 24 hours, and that the furthest galaxies are moving 30 trillion times faster than the speed of light. So the reason they start in that direction is because they say the Bible says that the earth shall not be moved. And the Bible is God's word, and we trust God above everything. But the same Hebrew root word for the earth shall not be moved says that you shall not be moved, and it says the king shall not be moved. So obviously, it doesn't mean what they think it means. Certainly, there are earthquakes, and the earthquakes move the earth from one end to the other. So the earth can be moved, and of course, with heliocentrism, we have a much better now understanding of cosmology. And the church has never been against that, ever. Of course, the church, starting with Plato, and people like to say it started with Aristotle, but it was Plato who had his creation myth with the earth in the center. And so geocentrism, as far as, that was held by the church, and it took people who believed in the Bible and in God, like Copernicus, Johann Kepler, and Isaac Newton, who wrote more about theology than he did about math and physics. It took those creationists to help the world come out of the days that we were put in by the ancient Greeks.
I have a niece that I've interviewed once, and in that interview, she said proudly and openly and publicly that there is no morality. There's only the illusion of morality because everything is hard determined by natural cause and effect. She's studying at university, and I've invited her back to talk to me since I'm now a young Earth creationist. I want to get her opinion about evolution. And her field of study is actually biology, along with all the genetic stuff. So I'm wondering, what can I say to this young atheist who believes fully in evolution? What approach can I take? Because I can't talk about Jesus, I can't talk about Noah, I can't talk about Moses, and I don't know the science. So what productive line of reasoning can I take with this young girl?
Well, there might be, quite often it's good to focus on something very specific. And, Darwin wrote about vision and the eye and our ability to see. And he said, even though he believed it evolved by a non-directed process, he said, I admit it seems absurd in the highest degree to think that the eye could evolve. So he said, I believe it, but I admit it seems absurd. And what we've known since, it's way more absurd now than then. And if you think about the atheist who says eyesight, vision systems evolved dozens of different times because they find it in dozens of different organisms and families that they think did not have a common ancestor. So they need something as difficult as vision, eyesight, to evolve dozens of times. And when you think about how your brain sees, right, we have a little meme. It's our evolution vision challenge. And we show a TV screen filled with static. And we say, this is what a brain sees. And then the other TV screen has a beautiful flower in it. It says, this is what a brain does not see. So your rods and cones, they register these incoming photons, and a signal gets encoded. And it's encoded in this chemical electrical signal that goes through your optic nerve to your optic cortex, where this encoded signal is decoded. And what the evolutionist likes to imagine is that some little insect, is somehow gets a little pimple on part of its body and it becomes light sensitive and eventually has enough kids and eventually it can see, But our vision system, our eyes, they're encoding data, transmitting it, and it's being decoded. And if you look at what's coming out of the other end of your optic nerve, it would look like static on your TV. If you did an analogy of water in your kitchen faucet, turn on your kitchen faucet full force, put your hand under it, and make believe each molecule of water was carrying some visual information. And now you have to figure out how to interpret that visual information. It is complex to the most extreme degree. And what the evolutionist does is give a kindergarten version of what's happening. And even at that, to them, it's absurd in the highest degree.
Yeah. There are millions of people who believe in evolution, and it seems like all of the evidence is on their side. But I guess if you have the time to dig in, you'll find absurd oversimplifications everywhere, right? But your average person that takes evolution for granted is not interested in doing that because he just takes it for granted that it's all true, right?
Yes. We have photoreceptor cells. In them, they have these proteins called opsin. When a single photon strikes opsin, and it releases a chemical signal, a single photon. You can't get better than that. And so I debated a professor of ophthalmology from Cal State, Northridge, and he said, well, before we debate, you need to read my colleague's textbook, just out, Evolution's Witness, How Eyes Evolved. Okay, so I get the book, read the book, and I wrote a prediction in the book when it was delivered by FedEx. This thing cost me over $100. And I wrote the prediction, and I got people to sign as my witnesses. And this book is going to have virtually nothing in it about how eyes evolved. It's only going to be an anatomy book about the different kinds of eyes in different organisms. And that's it. Maybe that's it. There should be a chapter on how opsin evolved. They hardly mention it in the whole book.
Are you familiar with Aaron Ra?
Oh, I've debated him in writing and on the radio.
Okay, I watched a couple of his videos about the classification of life. And in the first video, it's sort of an introduction, he talks about how life comes from non-life. And he says, let me find the quote for you here. He says something really funny. Yeah, so here it is here. He says at 4 minutes 14 of this video, which is called Systematic Classification of Life, Episode 1, The Root of the Tree, he says at 4 minutes and 14 seconds, So how did life arise from inorganic matter? It didn't, because viruses in all possible previous stages to life are based on complex carbon chains that were already what scientists would identify as organic chemicals. So that's his answer. He's saying, how did life come from inorganic matter? It didn't, because it came from organic chemicals. It's a completely false distinction. It says in Wikipedia, it says for many centuries, this is from Wikipedia now on organic compounds. It says for many centuries, Western physicians and chemists believed in vitalism. This was the widespread conception that substances found in organic nature are created from the chemical elements by the action of a vital force, a life force, that only living organisms possess. Vitalism taught that these quote-unquote organic compounds were fundamentally different from the quote-unquote inorganic compounds that could be obtained from the elements by chemical manipulations. So this is a false distinction. It's an outmoded superstition about organic chemistry.
Right. So we use organic in two different ways. One, we talk about organisms, biological living organisms, and then we talk about organic chemistry. And I think he was fooling himself. I don't know if he smokes pot or what, but Arun Ra confuses himself at every turn, David. I asked the question of NASA's leading astrobiologist this past year, major science conference in Germany. Her name is Dr. Wojtek, and Mary Wojtek. And so there's this panel, 5 incredible scientists. It's the host is one of the editors of the journal Science. And so he read my question from Bob, an independent science reporter, and I asked her this. I said, Mary, isn't it true that water is not an asset for life to arise from matter? In fact, water is the enemy of prebiotic molecules, because water is the universal solvent, and outside of a living organism, water dissolves life's building blocks. And then I was glad that the host of this panel discussion, he listed all the things that water dissolves. And David, it's unbelievable. Water is relentless. It dissolves amino acids. They're the things that form proteins. It involves sugars, including, RNA and DNA, monosaccharides, disaccharides. It dissolves peptides of all kinds. It dissolves non-peptide ribosome enzymes, countless kinds of polymers, all kinds of carbohydrates. So everything you need to start life, water will destroy virtually all of it. So it's a bait and switch. When NASA says, well, we think there's life, up on a moon of Jupiter or Saturn, we think there's life up there because we found water up there. Well, Mary Wojtek acknowledged that water is a challenge, and for them to get any kind of chemical reaction to continue, they have to dehydrate the specimen. And the other scientist and the host of this thing, he's like, well, you're saying that water is a problem? And she's like, well, yeah, we got to dehydrate. And they all thought, and this is after decades, right? They all thought that if you had water, you'd get life. Water is the problem. But what's interesting is it's not only water. Everything you need for life would destroy life from arising, like oxygen. Oxygen destroys prebiotic molecules. Sunlight destroys them. Ions, we need ions, even in bacteria. Ions destroy these prebiotic molecules. Time destroys these molecules that might happen to form 1 out of 100 quadrillion billion forms, and then time and water and sunlight and oxygen and ions, they'll all destroy it.
I studied physics at university, and a lot of people got very excited about the philosophical speculation that goes hand in hand with science, and especially new exciting sciences. So the new science, of course, is quantum physics and relativity and these sorts of things. And so there's that Copenhagen interpretation, which people go crazy about. They love it. I've always rejected it. Even when I was an atheist, I knew it was absurd. It was ridiculous. But it's the same thing with the other sciences. People get very excited buying these popularized books about so-called science, which are really just sloppy philosophy and sloppy speculation. And so the whole idea came to mind for me about technology. What we can't argue with is people today doing stuff with their scientific knowledge. For example, the technology we're using right now, like I said, the technology relies on advanced new physics like quantum physics. We can get practical results out of the stuff we've learned about the quantum realm. Is it the same with evolution? Is there one example of a technology that we could not have access to if we rejected the wild chronologies of evolution?
That's a brilliant question, and your audience should know that you did not set me up with that question, and you didn't know that I listened to your podcast where you brought that up, and your guest did a bait and switch. You said, are there any technologies that need Darwinism to be true? And I would extend that to the Big Bang. And of course, the answer is no. We could change our views on origins, and nobody's cell phone is going to stop working. No MRI machine. Satellite's not going to fall out of the sky when the next discovery that dismantles the Big Bang, and they come every few months, there's another one of those. So our technologies, when you look at the fathers of the physical sciences, they mostly, before and after Darwin, they were mostly creationists. You know, people like Kepler, Galileo, Newton, Mendel, Bacon, Pascal, Dalton, Faraday, Joule, Kelvin, Lister, go on. Wright brothers, Carver, all the technologies that came from their discoveries, these are things like whether X-rays or the inventor of the MRI, I had him on the show repeatedly, Raymond Damadian, extraordinary young earth creationist. None of these technologies require the Big Bang or Darwinism or atheism to work, and most of them are the fruit of the disciplines that were pioneered by biblical creationists. So he did a bait and switch. You said, name me one technology that requires your belief in evolution. And he said, the entire field of biology. You remember that? He's talking about a belief system, and many biologists believe that God was involved. And medical science is applied biology. And the majority of medical doctors believe that God had to be involved in the origin of life.
One of the accusations I get since I came out of the closet as a young earth creationist, one comment, which was, I guess, supposed to be biting, was that, David, you've now lost all credibility. Well, I mean, you're an atheist. I'm a Catholic. What credibility did I have with you? You know, I'm not a scientist. I don't have any credibility. I don't have any credentials. I don't have any reputation. I don't have any laboratory. I don't have any students. I don't have any books. I don't have anything. I'm just a schmuck who happens to submit to God Almighty. I don't have any credibility, and I don't want credibility. I want to point to God. So I want to talk about the psychology of the peer pressure, where I was supposed to feel somehow that I would get back in line. And some people would say to me, well, David, if I could prove this to you, would you get back in line? Would you come back? Would you come back to evolution? Would you come back? Would you come back? Why are they motivated to get me back in line? And why do they think I care about my reputation? What's going on psychologically?
That's incredible that you could utter that sentence. That really is something, David. Why should I care about my reputation? The Bible says that we're fools for Christ's sake, and they mocked and hated him. And if they hated him, they will hate us, those who love him. And the lies, the long war against God uses propaganda. So when he said to you that all of biology is based on evolution, I had a paper published in a peer-reviewed journal analyzing Dobzhansky as the scientist who first said that. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And in his paper, he made 3 or 4 predictions, and over the next 40 years, all of them were falsified. It's really unbelievable how completely wrong he was. But the National Academy of Sciences, our most prestigious scientific body in America, Dr. Philip Skell, he's now recently passed away. He was a member of the National Academy. He said, and this is on our page about the fathers of the sciences being creationist. He said that he asked more than 70 eminent researchers over a period of years if they would have done their work differently if they thought Darwin's theory was wrong. And he said the response from everyone was the same: no. He said he analyzed 100 Nobel Prizes in biology over the last century. 100 prizes. And he said he couldn't find one that depended in any way upon Darwinian concepts, not one paper. They publish in the journal Nature and they say, and evolution did this. And if you leave out those words, it doesn't change the paper at all. The discovery is just as amazing. So those words add nothing. I just interviewed Michael Behe. He's one of the leading ID, intelligent design authors. He wrote Darwin's Black Box and now Darwin Devolves. And he points out that the successes that they claim are when proteins break down. When there are mutations and things break down, you end up with sickle cell disease in Africa, but now you can't catch malaria because malaria can't get a foothold if you have sickle cell disease. So that's like the best exhibit that the evolutionists have. They say, look, evolution works. No, that's examples of things breaking down. And yes, things do break down, but only God built them up.
What do you think of those two guys, Kent Hovind and Ken Ham?
I think Kent Hovind, I think he loves God, and I think he's reached a lot of people, but sometimes he could be a caricature of himself. I think so. His son, Eric Hovind, is amazing, and his father spent a lot of time in jail, and his son, Eric Hovind, is full-time young earth creationist, but on the order of Ken Ham's type of work.
Okay. Are there other big names I haven't mentioned to you there?
Huge names, huge. I think the greatest scientist alive, today's Isaac Newton, is a man named Dr. Walt Brown, who is truly brilliant. Many predictions about astronomy and geology, and just astounding predictions that have come true. And we have piggybacked off his work for many years now. And we, Real Science Radio, that's what we call our Friday show. We've made many predictions and we keep track of them. We document them, and many have been confirmed, including our dinosaur soft tissue predictions. And so Dr. Walt Brown, out of Australia, out of New Zealand, Jonathan Sarfati, who's now living in the U.S. Yeah, there are incredible names. These guys are, who's the MIT PhD, who's published in the journal Nature. There are thousands of scientists who reject Darwin. And there are also thousands who not only reject Darwin, but who are young earth creationists.
Yeah, one of the proofs that I think I can use without having a lot of knowledge about science, biology, cosmology, and all these sorts of things, I think I can have recourse to proof just from the bare fact of abortion. If evolution is true, then abortion is okay. Abortion is not okay, therefore evolution is false. Can you talk about that proof?
I think that's absolutely valid reasoning. If we're just animals, abortion is fine. Animals eat one another. They eat their young alive. So when people defend the most disgusting human behavior and they say animals do it, well, then I say, well, that's probably your best argument that you act like a pig or a dog, but that's not, it's not a valid argument, but it's probably the best one you'll ever come up with, that you're like a pig or you're like a dog. But abortion is wrong because it's a baby, and it's always wrong to intentionally kill a baby, and that's because children are made in God's image, and God said, do not kill the innocent. So abortion is wrong, but you're exactly right. David, we have a video called Get Out of the Matrix. We used to go to college campuses and we let the camera roll from when we get there. And I asked students in the cafeteria, was it absolutely wrong for the Germans to slaughter millions of men, women, and children? And they'll think for a minute and they'll say millions, absolutely wrong. And they'll say, no, it wasn't wrong. Why not? Because there's no such thing. Because if it feels good, do it. There's no right and wrong. There's only preference. And that is the conclusion to an atheist worldview.
Really scary. So I guess we should touch on something a little bit more controversial, because the Protestant listener that recommended I talk to you, I think he was expecting fireworks. So can you just sort of tell me why you're not Catholic and what objections you have to Catholicism, please?
The reasons I gave you earlier, when I realized that the church had really rejected Genesis and Exodus, so that even the Ten Commandments have no historical foundation in the genealogy of Christ and the teachings of Christ. His genealogy has no historical foundation, and his teachings are inaccurate. And so we're supposed to take his historical teachings as though they were parables. If all that is a parable, how do we know that there's any real need to pay for the sin of the world? If it's all a parable, where does the truth start? So I felt like I was pushed out of the Catholic Church, but I'm now glad that I was, because I think that while the Catholic Church is right, that there is authority in the church itself. The Catholic Church is right on that. But that doesn't mean that you won't be tempted to overemphasize the church and underemphasize God's word. And so I think that's what happened. God's word is underemphasized. The authority of the church is overemphasized. And we end up with a time where there's crisis all over the world. In the U.S., 1 out of 3 Catholics have said, to some level, they're ashamed to be Catholic because of the crisis. In fact, Benedict just came out with, you may have read his paper, he confirmed what we've been saying on the air for 28 years, that the crisis in the Catholic Church. I've a recent interview with a guy who was molested by a Denver Catholic priest here, and that priest molested many kids, and a couple committed suicide. One left a handwritten note, unbelievable, horrific. And the church has never apologized, never come clean to the families. That's here in Denver. But Benedict wrote that the seeds of the worldwide crisis was when the seminaries accepted homosexuality as the norm, and they even had homosexual clubs in seminaries. And he said that happened in the 1960s. And David, I've been saying that on my show for years, that when the seminaries went homosexual in the 60s, what happened later, the history was just bearing the fruit of that, because God made us male and female.
On that note, what do you think about Catholics? Is it possible to be a Christian and a Catholic?
Yeah, 2 Catholics over the decades have preached at our church. Ambassador Alan Keyes, he was ambassador under Ronald Reagan, one of the heroes in the battle to end abortion. And he has preached at Denver Bible Church. The other, Jason Jones, who's another hero in the fight to end the killing of innocent children. But I think that Jesus said, many will say, Lord, Lord, and I'll say, I never knew you. I think there are Protestant denominations that are virtually lost and will never come back. And I think that's also true of Catholics. Among Protestants, if there's heresy, there tends to be a split, a division, and yet another denomination is born. The Catholic Church has just continually absorbed really all that blasphemy. And I spent a couple years on the campus of Notre Dame. You know, homosexuality and pro-abortion, and that's pretty much the culture of Notre Dame. So the Catholics have just continued to absorb all the filth and the wickedness and the hatred against God, and it's like a bloated tumor filled with pus. I hate to describe it that way, but the Protestants, they have an opposite problem of constant dividing. So both approaches are problematic, but what we look out and we see in the world around us, the Catholic Church is awash in immorality, wickedness, and the Protestant Church, much of it is post-Christian.
I was raised in a church called the United Church of Canada. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's the biggest denomination in Canada. Have you heard about it?
No, I'm so sorry. I haven't. That's terrible.
You can look into it. It's very, very interesting because now they have atheist ministers that are allowed to preach as United Church of Canada ministers. So, I mean, just very, very briefly, I want you to talk about the early church fathers' belief in the real presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist, and then talk about Mary, the Mother of God. Could you just talk about those 2 sticking points, please, from your perspective?
Well, I would never say, I know that some of the councils did, I would never say Mary, Mother of God, because it could confuse people who may think that she's actually not only the human mother of Jesus Christ, who's fully God and fully man, but they might think that she's the mother of God, like God the Father. And there are millions of people who get confused about who to worship. And idolatry is if you worship anyone other than God or anything. So I would call Mary the mother of Jesus, the mother of the incarnate Son of God, God the Son. But The Bible honors her, Jesus honors her, and I'm sure she'll be honored throughout all of eternity future. But it doesn't mean that we can't do harm in the guise of honoring her. And as far as the Eucharist, you might know more than I do. When I was first a Christian in 1973, now I even forget some of the names of the collections of the writings of the early fathers, but I read a lot of that early on in the 70s, and I forget most of it now.
What would it take to convince you that Jesus Christ founded the Catholic Church and that he instituted all 7 sacraments and that there's no salvation outside of the Catholic Church? What would it take to convince you?
Well, the Catholic Church pretty much teaches anybody could be saved. So that last one, you'd have to first convince the Catholic Church of that.
Well, anyone can be saved, but to be saved, you have to get into the ark of Noah.
No, I mean, the Catholic Church is said in 1,000 ways. The priest we had Bible studies with said, you don't have to be a Catholic. You don't have to believe in Jesus to be saved. So we said, then why do we need to keep going to the Catholic Church? Got himself in quite a dilemma.
Yeah, that was a stupid thing to say.
So it's mostly Protestants that have been faithful to Jesus' teaching that I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. The Catholic Church has done what to try to bring Jews to the Lord or Muslims to the Lord? I don't know what the Catholic Church has done, whereas my little church, Denver Bible Church, we've brought, homosexuals to the Lord and atheists, and we've gone to Israel to witness, to minister to Jews and Muslims. I don't see the Catholic Church as really having any kind of an evangelical outreach to Jews at all. They've either written them off and don't care if they go to hell. I don't think that's the reason. I think the reason is they think they don't need Jesus. They're just fine. Just be true to their faith.
Yeah, those are both bad options.
Yeah. Yeah, and the only good option is to love your neighbor, be he Jew or Muslim, Buddhist. Love him enough to share the truth of Jesus Christ.
So what kind of reputation do you have? Are you seen as a wacko, extremist nut job? Or are you seen as a nice guy, moderate, fair-minded pillar of the community? What's your reputation?
I'm the black sheep of the Denver pastoral community. Our church goes to the abortion mill every day they're open since the 90s, and we have confirmed saves of over 1,000 babies whose moms had scheduled abortions, and we bring the signs, we call out to the moms. I typically say something like, you could be loved with your baby. You don't have to kill your baby for someone to love you. There's help for you. Please let us talk to you. And we don't count it as a save unless the mom talks to us. She had an abortion scheduled and she's changed her mind. And many times, David, they'll come back like on a birthday or an anniversary and they'll bring the baby. And so that's our little church, Denver Bible Church. Every day, Planned Parenthood has been open since the 90s. We've been there.
Wow, unbelievable. At the end of my episodes, I do ask my guests to give the closing thought. So just to leave the show on a positive note, what could you say to anyone that's out there listening now?
Jesus, when he came, he didn't lead an army, he didn't write a book, but we date our transactions. Billions of instances every single day that are dated, and every single one is a testimony to Jesus Christ. Every single one. We have 7 days in a week because God created in 6 days and rested on the seventh. And although there are differences in cultures and different centuries, overwhelmingly, the wheels of commerce, they cease turning on Sundays. And it's not on the Sabbath anymore, Saturday, but it's Sunday for one and only one reason every week, because we remember that Jesus Christ rose from the dead on the first day of the week. And because he rose, we can live forever if we trust in him.
If you like your worldview, if you think it's swell, if you got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is ask.